7 Beliefs About Money You Inherited Without Knowing. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the psyche keeps a ledger far older than the one in your banking app, an inherited ledger written before you could read, and it balances itself in your body long before it ever reaches your conscious mind. As Jung wrote in Ion, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate, and I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is not poetry, it is a clinical observation. Jung would stop you right there and say, do you see it? The flinch you feel reaching for your wallet did not begin with you, it began somewhere at a kitchen table you were too young to remember, and because it was never made conscious, it did not disappear. It simply moved house, and now it lives in your spending, in your saving, in the tightness in your chest when a bill arrives, dressed up as your own personality, when in fact, it is something older, something inherited, something running your accounts without asking your permission. So let us name it plainly, before we go further. Say it with me. I notice the old tightening in my chest when money is mentioned, and I do not call it weakness. I trace the belief back to the table, where it was first served, and I do not call it betrayal. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I notice the old tightening in my chest when money is mentioned, and I do not call it weakness. I trace the belief back to the table where it was first served, and I do not call it betrayal. I make the unconscious conscious. And if this kind of seeing matters to you, I would ask you to subscribe now, so that tomorrow's teaching finds its way to you as well. Before we go further, if something in what I just said made you go quiet, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments. Let it be a small seal on what you already know is true. The first key is that the belief did not begin with you. It began at a table you cannot remember. Jung called these inherited knots of feeling and memory complexes, splinter psyches he named them, small autonomous personalities living inside the larger one, each with its own history, its own emotional charge, its own agenda, and money is one of the most fertile stimulus words a complex can find, because money touches survival, touches shame, touches love and its withholding, all at once. Imagine a woman who cannot explain why she feels a wave of dread every time she checks her balance. She is not weak, she is not irrational, she is constellated, meaning some old configuration of fear has been triggered by the stimulus, and for one instant, the complex is driving and she is a passenger. This is not a character flaw, this is architecture, built long before she had a vote in the matter. Now let me give you a fuller picture of how such an architecture gets built. Because it rarely arrives in one dramatic scene, imagine a boy of 7 sitting at a kitchen table doing homework, while in the next room his parents argue in low, tight voices about an overdue bill. He does not hear every word. He does not need to. What he absorbs instead is the temperature of the room, the way his mother's shoulders draw up near her ears when the mail arrives, the way his father goes quiet for the rest of the evening after a certain phone call. None of this is explained to him, none of it is even meant for him, and yet his small nervous system takes careful notes and files them away long before he owns a wallet of his own. 20 years later, that same boy, now a grown man with a stable income, feels his stomach drop every time an envelope with a window arrives in his mailbox. He assumes this is simply his personality. He calls himself anxious about money. He may even call himself bad with money. But Jung would ask him a quieter, more exact question. Whose fear is this really? And the honest answer, more often than not, is that it is not entirely his own. It is borrowed, inherited, carried forward, like an heirloom nobody remembers agreeing to keep. And notice, this is not only a story about scarcity. The same quiet transfer happens in houses where money was never spoken of at all, where a single raised eyebrow at the dinner table taught a child that wanting things out loud was vulgar, and in houses where every purchase was announced like a small victory, teaching a different child that having is the only proof of being loved. The content of the lesson changes from table to table, but the mechanism Jung described stays exactly the same, a feeling absorbed before language. The second key is that money is what Jung would have called a stimulus word. And before we go further, I want you to actually see the room where he discovered this, because it was not a lecture hall. It was the Bergholzli Hospital, early in his career, long before the world had heard the name Carl Jung, and he sat ordinary patients down, one at a time, with nothing more dramatic than a list of common words, table, mother, water, and money among them, and he read each word aloud in a flat, even voice, stopwatch in his hand, and he simply measured how many seconds passed before the patient could answer. Sometimes he attached instruments to measure the breath and the skin as well, because the body, he had already begun to suspect, keeps its own records, even when the mind insists it has nothing to say. And here is what he found. Most words moved through a person the way water moves through an open channel. Quick, unremarkable, gone before you would even notice the current. But every so often, a word would hit something submerged, and the patient would stall, or stammer, or answer strangely, or answer far too quickly, in a rehearsed voice that did not match their eyes. And Jung learned to treat every one of those delays the way a cartographer treats a swamp on an otherwise plain map, not as an error to be corrected, but as a place worth marking. Because a delay of even half a second was never random, it meant the word had brushed against a complex, and the complex had to be quietly consulted before the ego was permitted to speak on its own behalf. Now take that same instrument and turn it toward your own life for a moment, because you do not need a laboratory, you only need honesty. Imagine you are sitting at dinner with friends. The check arrives, and someone says the words "split it evenly," and before your mind has even finished forming an opinion, something in your chest has already tightened. Or imagine a colleague at work says the single word "raise," and your throat goes dry half a second before you have decided how you feel about asking for one. Or imagine someone you love says the words, "We should talk about our savings," and your whole body straightens, as if for an argument that has not even begun. None of these are accidents, and none of them are really about the dinner, or the raise, or the savings account at all. They are your own private word list, quietly revealing itself, the way Jung's patients revealed theirs, one syllable at a time. And if you are willing to sit with that discomfort, instead of rushing past it, you may notice that underneath the delay, there is very often a single sentence waiting, spoken in a voice older than yours. There is never enough. And I want you to hear how ordinary that sentence sounds, how easily it passes as simple caution or common sense, when in truth it is a belief with a birthday, a belief that was spoken at some table long before you arrived at it, spoken so often that no one in the house could remember any more who had said it first, only that it was always true there, and that, more than any single overspend or underspend, is the real inheritance. Not the number in the account, but the half-second of hesitation before the number is even mentioned. I let my own hesitation teach me, instead of shaming me. The third key is that you do not need a crisis to see this working. You only need one ordinary day. So walk it with me slowly, because the whole argument lives in the ordinariness, not in the drama. 7 in the morning, you glance at your phone before you are even out of bed, and there is a small tightening when you see the notification from your bank. So small you would never call it a belief, you would just call it Monday. But that is the first belief moving. There is never enough. 7:15. You lie there another moment doing quiet arithmetic in your head. Rent against income, a habit so old and so automatic that you have stopped noticing you are doing it at all. The way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator. 8 in the morning. You make coffee at home instead of buying it, because buying it would feel reckless somehow, even though the difference is a few coins. And you tell yourself, this is simply being sensible, when in fact, sensible is often the mask a complex wears, so it does not have to explain itself. 9 in the morning. A colleague mentions a bonus, and something in you curls slightly inward, not quite jealousy, more like a discomfort at even discussing figures out loud. That is the second belief, the one that says, talking about money plainly is shameful. Keep it behind closed doors. 10 in the morning. You notice you have opened 3 different tabs comparing prices on something small, an item that costs less than your lunch, And you cannot say exactly why it matters so much, only that it does. 11 in the morning. Imagine a man named Thomas, ordinary, easy to like, who is offered a raise for doing work he already knows how to do well, and instead of feeling simple gladness, he feels a flicker of suspicion, as if the offer must be a mistake, or a trick, or a debt that will come due later. He cannot explain the feeling. He only knows it arrives faster than his thinking does. He even finds himself glancing at the door of his supervisor's office afterward, half expecting to be called back in and told it was all an error. Noon. You are offered a project that pays well but asks little of your time, and part of you distrusts it. Surely it should cost you more sweat than this. That is the third belief, that money must be earned through exhaustion, that ease and reward cannot coexist without punishment following close behind. 1 in the afternoon. Thomas accepts the raise but finds himself working later hours than before, unasked, as though some invisible ledger required him to balance the gift with suffering. 2 in the afternoon. You skip a lunch you can easily afford, telling yourself you are simply not hungry, though the truth is closer to a quiet penance you did not consent to and cannot quite name. 3 in the afternoon. You see someone spending freely, confidently, without apology, and a small verdict rises in you before you can stop it. Must be nice. Or worse, something is wrong with people like that. That is the fourth belief, that those who have money have taken something, that wealth and goodness cannot occupy the same room. 4 in the afternoon. You catch yourself doing the arithmetic again, differently this time, comparing what you have to what someone else appears to have, and feeling smaller for it, though nothing in your actual life has changed in the last hour. 5 in the afternoon. You rehearse how you will explain a purchase to no one in particular, an imaginary judge who is not even in the room, and you notice, if you are honest, that this judge has a very particular tone of voice, one you recognize from somewhere far earlier than today. 6 in the evening. You consider buying something you actually want, nothing extravagant, and you feel a small current of guilt attach itself to the pleasure before you have even paid. That is the fifth belief, that spending is indulgence and saving alone is virtue. 7 in the evening. Thomas mentions his raise at dinner almost apologetically, quietly, as though it were a confession rather than good news, and his family, without quite meaning to, moves the conversation along quickly, the way a household moves past a subject it has never learned how to hold. 8 in the evening. You check your balance one more time before bed, not because anything has changed since morning, but because the checking itself has become a small ritual of reassurance, or of punishment, depending on the number. And by the time you both lie down at night, none of these moments felt dramatic. None of them announced themselves as belief. They felt like simply having a normal day, like simply being who you are. And that is exactly the point Jung was making about complexes in general. They do not arrive with trumpets. They arrive disguised as your personality, as your good sense, as just how you are about money, dressed so convincingly as your own nature that you would defend them as fiercely as you would defend your own name, when in fact you were only reciting a script someone handed you before you could read the label on it. And the reason this matters so much is that most people go looking for their beliefs about money in the big decisions, the house, the job change, the inheritance itself, when in truth, the belief reveals itself far more honestly in the small, unremarkable hours, in the tab left open, the lunch skipped, the apology offered for good news. Pause for a moment and pick one real hour from your own day to day, any hour at all, and ask simply what you felt in your body during it, before you had time to explain it to yourself. I start noticing the ordinary hour where the old belief speaks instead of me. The fourth key is the hardest one to hear plainly, so I will say it plainly. Jung wrote that complexes can have us, meaning the relationship most people imagine, that they possess a complex the way they possess a coat they can take off, is often backward. In the grip of the constellation, it is the complex that is driving, and the ego that is merely narrating afterward, trying to make the outburst sound reasonable. Jung told of an aristocratic woman in his consulting room, ordinarily composed, mannered, entirely in control of herself, who under the pressure of a certain memory struck out and slapped him across the face before either of them fully understood what had happened, not because she was violent by nature, but because something older than her manners had been triggered and had, for one moment, taken the wheel. And I want you to notice how ordinary the setup was before it happened. No warning, no visible danger, only a word or a memory brushing against something buried. And suddenly, a woman who would never in her waking judgment raise a hand did exactly that. Now most of us will never slap anyone, so let us bring it down to a smaller, quieter scale. Imagine a man standing in a checkout line, calm all morning, mind on his errands, and the cashier mentions, almost in passing, that the price has gone up again, and something in him ignites, his voice sharpens, his hand trembles slightly folding the receipt, and he walks out of that store already a little ashamed of himself, telling himself he is simply tired, simply having a long week. But the truth, the harder truth, is that for those 30 seconds, something else was standing where he usually stands, wearing his voice, spending his composure, and he was, in that instant, a passenger in his own body. This is the pattern to watch for, not only in the dramatic slap, but in the receipt folded too tightly, the sudden sharp word to a partner over an overdraft notice, the irrational panic buying that undoes a week of careful budgeting in a single hour, the refusal to even open an envelope because some part of you already knows what is inside and cannot bear to look. In each of these, it is worth asking, quietly, afterward, whose reaction was that? Was that truly you deciding, weighing, choosing, or was that the old complex, the inherited belief, briefly wearing your face and speaking with your voice, while the real you stood somewhere just behind it, watching it happen the way you watch a stranger? This is not an excuse. Jung was never in the business of excusing behavior. He did not ask you to forgive yourself so much as to see yourself, clearly, without flinching. But it is a diagnosis, and a diagnosis, unlike a verdict, can be worked with. A verdict closes the case. A diagnosis opens the file again, and once the file is open, you can finally ask the only question that matters in this key. Not why am I like this, which only invites shame, but whose voice just spoke, which invites clarity. I ask whose voice just spoke before I call it my own. If this way of seeing money is helping you see yourself more clearly, I would love for you to be here for tomorrow's teaching too. Subscribing is the simplest way to make sure it finds you. The fifth key is the deepest one, the one that asks you to actually walk down into the room where the belief was first served. And I want to take this slowly, in pieces, because it deserves the time. First, consider the origin. Every one of the 7 beliefs we have named tonight, that there is never enough, that money must be earned through suffering, that spending is shameful, and saving alone is virtuous, that talking about money openly is indecent, that the wealthy have taken something from the rest of us, that people like us do not get ahead, and the 7th, the quiet one underneath all the others, that money itself is dangerous, that it corrupts whoever holds it too long. Every single one of these had a first telling. Someone said it, or lived it loudly enough that it did not need saying, at a table, in a car, in the tone of a parent's voice on the day the electricity was nearly cut off, or in the silence of a household where money was never discussed at all. Silence teaches as thoroughly as speech, and you absorbed it the way a child absorbs weather, without analysis, simply as the climate of the house you lived in. Imagine a man, I will call him the keeper of the cash box, who finds, years after his father's death, an old metal box in a closet, and inside it, alongside a few worn bills and coins no longer in circulation, a torn slip of paper with columns of figures and a single line written at the bottom. Do not trust it. Do not trust any of it. He sits on the floor of that closet a long while, because he recognizes the handwriting. But more than that, he recognizes the feeling. He has carried that very sentence his whole life without ever once seeing it written down. He simply thought it was his own private caution, his own good sense, and only now, holding the paper, does he understand that he inherited a warning meant for a different decade, a different crisis, a different man entirely, and he had been obeying it in rooms it was never written for. Second, consider how faithfully you have carried it. This is the part that asks for honesty rather than comfort. Because most people assume they rebelled against their parents' money story. I spend freely because my mother never did. I save obsessively because my father never could. But Jung would want you to look again, because rebellion is still obedience to the original complex, only worn inside out. The man who spends wildly against his frugal upbringing is still organized entirely around that upbringing, still answering it, still letting it set the terms, even in reversal. And the keeper of the cash box, the one from our story, had in fact done the opposite of his father his entire adult life, spending easily, laughing at caution, priding himself on not being like that. And yet notice, he had built his whole identity in reference to the very sentence he claims to have escaped. Freedom is not the opposite reaction. Freedom is seeing the whole shape of the thing clearly enough that you can finally choose rather than react. And this is worth sitting with a moment longer, because it means the spender and the hoarder in the same family are very often working from the identical inherited fear. They have simply chosen opposite costumes to wear while obeying it. Third, consider the shape of a single ordinary evening at that same man's table now, years later, with his own children, because inheritance does not wait for dramatic moments to pass itself along. It travels through the smallest gestures, the way he changes the subject too quickly when his daughter asks what things cost, the way he laughs off her question about savings with a joke instead of an answer, the way his son notices, without being told anything at all, that money is discussed only in low voices after the children are meant to be asleep. None of this is cruelty. None of it is even conscious. It is simply the old sentence, "Do not trust it," finding a new mouth to speak through. And this is the quiet weight of the fifth key, that the ledger you did not choose is, at this very moment, being copied into another hand, whether you intend it or not, unless something in the copying is finally seen. Fourth, consider the stopwatch again, but this time pointed at your own week, not as an experiment performed on you, but one you perform on yourself. Gently, without judgment, notice the words that make you hesitate. Notice the purchases you hide from people you love. Notice the ones you announce loudly, as if daring someone to object. Notice what you say about money to your children, because you are, whether you intend it or not, sitting at the head of the very table where the next inheritance will be served. And here is a smaller, quieter version of the same test. Notice what you do not say, the conversation you avoid with a partner, the number you round down when a friend asks how things are going, the relief you feel when a subject changes before it reaches your finances. Absence is data too. A room can be furnished entirely by what was never allowed to be spoken in it. Fifth, and this is the turn I most want you to feel, none of this makes you broken, and none of it is fixed the way a scar is fixed. Jung's whole teaching on complexes was never that they must be exorcised or defeated in some dramatic confrontation. It was simply this, that what is not made conscious continues to operate as fate, but what is made conscious begins, slowly, to loosen its grip, not because you have declared war on it, but because a complex depends on darkness, the way a shadow depends on unbroken light. The moment you can name it, there is never enough, and I learned that at a table I did not choose. The belief does not vanish, but it stops speaking with your full authority. It becomes one voice in the room instead of the only voice. Think again of the man with the cash box. He did not burn the slip of paper, and he did not frame it either. He simply kept it in a drawer where he could see it now and then, and he said later that the strange thing was not that the fear disappeared, it was that he could finally hear it as a sentence spoken by a frightened man in a hard year, rather than as the plain truth of the universe. And that hearing, that small shift from law to sentence, was the whole of his healing. Sixth, notice too that this work is never finished in one sitting, and that is not a discouragement, it is a mercy, because it means you are not required to solve your entire inheritance in one long night by the fire. You are only asked to catch one thread of it this week, one sentence, one flinch, one silence, and hold it up to the light long enough to ask where it was first spoken. And if you catch nothing at all this week, that too is not failure. The thread is still there tomorrow, patient, unhurried, waiting the way an old letter waits in a drawer, unbothered by how long it takes you to open it. That alone begins the descent, and that distinction, quiet as it sounds, is the entire difference between a life run by inheritance and a life that has finally opened its own ledger. I see the table where this began, and I am no longer only its student, I am also now its reader. The sixth key is small and practical, and it is meant to be, because none of what we have said tonight requires a dramatic reckoning. It requires only a habit, what I would call a trigger post-mortem, after any moment this week when money made you flinch, made you snap, made you hide a purchase, or refuse to open a bill. Sit for 2 minutes afterward and ask 3 quiet questions. What did I feel in my body in that instant? Whose voice does that feeling sound like when I listen closely? And is this belief actually mine, tested and chosen, or only inherited and never examined? Imagine a man standing at a grocery checkout, watching the total climb higher than he expected, and feeling his jaw tighten before the cashier has even finished scanning. He could simply pay and move on, but instead, he hears himself apologize under his breath for nothing at all, as if spending money on food were a small crime he must answer for. If he paused there, in the parking lot afterward, and asked the 3 questions, he might notice the feeling in his chest is the same one he felt as a boy watching his mother count coins carefully at a kitchen table, and he might notice that the voice which just spoke through him was not his own considered judgment at all, but hers, borrowed whole, still running some 40 years later, still setting the terms of what a grown man is allowed to feel over a grocery bill. This is the whole of the practice, not a single analysis performed once and then filed away, but a small return, again and again, to the same 3 questions, after the tense phone call about an overdue bill, after the sudden urge to buy something you do not need and cannot explain, after the quiet dread of opening an account you have been avoiding for days. You do not need an answer immediately. Jung trusted the slow method over the fast confession. The point is not to defeat the complex in one sitting. The point is simply to keep meeting it awake instead of asleep, because a complex met while asleep runs the whole household, and a complex met while awake becomes, however slowly, only one voice among several. And there is a second use to this habit, beyond any single moment, because a pattern kept honestly over weeks becomes its own kind of evidence. You may find the same words surfacing in your 2-minute answers again and again, not enough, or earned, or shameful, or dangerous. And when a single word repeats like that, week after week, you are no longer guessing at the shape of the inheritance, you are reading it plainly, the way Jung once read the delay in a patient's answer to a single stimulus word at that hospital desk. And once a pattern is read plainly, in your own handwriting, it can no longer hide behind the comfortable name of simply how I am about money. Because every time you do this small, unglamorous thing, you are doing exactly what Jung meant. Here is the whole picture. The belief did not begin with you. It began at a table you cannot remember. Your hesitation over money is not weakness. It is a stimulus word finding an old complex. One ordinary day is enough to watch the inheritance operate in full. The sharp word, or the panic purchase, is often the complex speaking, and not you. The origin can be traced, the rebellion can be seen as another form of obedience, and the small habit of asking whose voice that was can be practiced this very week. And underneath all 6 of these, there was only ever one recognition trying to reach you, that the 7 beliefs about money you inherited, without knowing, were never facts about the world. They were facts about a table, a household, a climate you did not choose, and facts about a table can be revisited, examined, and finally, gently, corrected by a grown person standing in the light instead of a child still sitting in the old chair. I notice the old tightening in my chest when money is mentioned, and I do not call it weakness. I trace the belief back to the table where it was first served, and I do not call it betrayal. I make the unconscious conscious. And if that is true, then the beliefs you inherited without knowing are also, at last, beliefs you can finally examine with your eyes open. What would your ledger say? If you were the one writing it now,